What about these games can specifically make it hard to revisit them?
It's kind of a tricky subject because everybody has their own individual experiences.
Is there any specific reasons that, like, we can't enjoy older games?
Hello, everyone, and welcome back to another episode of the Level Up Podcast. I'm your host, Murph, as always, with my good friend, Cal.
Hello, Murph. It's me, Cal, here to talk about video games.
Hello, Cal. So today, Cal, we have a pretty interesting topic. This is one that we've kind of talked about in passing before.
We've talked around this topic a lot.
Yeah, but this is something that we want to tackle kind of head on, and it's about enjoying old video games.
Yeah, so I think this topic maybe applies to me a lot more than it applies to you. You seem in our experience together, I'm sure we'll talk about this a little bit more, but in the time that we've spent talking about video games, for whatever reason, I seem to bounce off older games a lot more than you do. You're like, yeah, I hopped into the first game of this series that I enjoyed, and I had a great time, and everything was fine. And when I try to jump into an old game, well, I have some more problems than that.
Yeah, so that's something.
Yeah, it's a lot to talk about.
Yeah, that's something that I think a lot of people have run into, where either you like classic video games and then somebody recommends a game and you try it and you're like, I don't get it, I don't see it, like I'm just not having fun with it. Is there something wrong with me? Or say you're somebody who just likes video games in general, but you've mostly done like modern stuff and haven't really done much classic retro stuff. And so people come to you and say, hey, there's all these good classic video games that you should try. These are some of the games that have been considered like best of all time. And then you try one or two of them out and you're like, I don't get it. I just don't get it. And so I feel like this is a pretty common thing that people kind of run into, regardless of your experience with video gaming.
And it's tough too, because a lot of these classic games are still objectively good or, historically great. They're just harder to play. Or I think a stumbling block that a lot of them run into perhaps is that what originally made them into a classic has become common in video games today. But beyond that stumbling block, which I'm sure we'll talk about a little bit later, what about these games can specifically make it hard to revisit them? What can make you bounce off some of these really old games? We have a bunch of different problems that these games can present with themselves, but we're going to start with the obvious at the very top. Old games, by definition, run on much older hardware and much older versions of software than we have available to us now. In Murph and I's lifetime, we're in our later 20s, but we're still pretty young men. But I think our lifetime especially is kind of defined by a rapid acceleration of technological ability in hardware and software, even compared to what had already come in the video game space and in the rest of the world, like in the preceding 15, 20 years, right? And so even if we're trying to play games from the beginning of our lifetime to now, there's a lot of hardware and software limitations that can come up. Isn't that right, Murph?
Yeah. So specifically, some of the problems with old hardware that people have run into that makes things like less enjoyable is lack of saves. So this is one thing that is pretty much completely the case for all old Atari stuff. Most NES stuff will not have saves. There's a few, like the original Legend of Zelda, that will have a save battery in there. But it's very not common. That was like a new novel idea. The Super Nintendo era / Sega Genesis kind of, you start to see a little bit more where you would have these save batteries in games. It still wasn't quite like half of them. I would say like maybe a third to a half, somewhere in there, had saves, but there were still plenty of games that didn't. It wasn't until you got to like the PS1 and 64 era of gaming that you start to see those saves be built in more.
I was going to say, even with the N64, you could be in trouble with some games if you didn't have a memory card for your controller.
True, which was a little bit weird, but
pretty
still,
far and few between.
Yeah, you still did have the opportunity to save. That was still an option. Even if you needed that extra memory card to do so, you still could.
Yes.
So the lack of saves cause some problems when you're just trying to enjoy a game, because saves are like commonplace. You don't really think about saving at all in modern games. It's just kind of the thing that happens.
Yeah. Yeah, the vast majority of games these days, you don't even have to manually save.
Yeah, it's will just auto save.
You. Yeah.
Because I don't know about you, but I remember a lot of games from when I was a kid. You would say, do you want to save? You would say yes. And then it would say, it's going to overwrite your old save. Are you sure you want to do this? And I'm like, I don't know. And I always felt bad doing that.
Yeah. Warning! You're overwriting the other save.
Are you sure? But I think that developers learned that you don't need to be so like exaggerated about it. You can just kind of do it in the background, and people have become accustomed to it. And I think that is for the better.
Yes, definitely.
Because I don't want to think about saves. I just want it to happen. And if I exit out, if the power goes out, if something like that happens, I should be able to reload the game, be somewhere close to where I was, and be ready to go.
Mm-hmm. So yeah, a lot of these games, a lot of these really early games, this is obviously only going to be a problem up for us up until a certain generation of games like Murph was talking about. But when you're playing those games, if you can't save your progress, then, well, especially if you're like a busier adult, then good luck ever beating those games, I guess, unless you're just built different.
That is the biggest issue, is that I'm a person who wants to sit down and play video games for maybe a half an hour in between stuff. And so it's very difficult to actually beat a game like, say, Super Mario Bros. 3 for the NES. The game's actually quite big. It has 8 big worlds, a full world map. There's like anywhere from 5 to 8 stages or whatever on each individual world, secrets to find, all that stuff. But there's no save function. You have to do the whole thing in one sitting. And so I have no motivation to sit down and play the game if after half an hour I'm just gonna have to turn it off, lose all of my progress, and do it all over again.
Yeah, and it's like theoretically you have gotten more skilled at the game or whatever, and have learned the levels or what have you, or the mechanics of the game more and more. So maybe the next time you boot it up, yeah, you have to play through that stuff again, but your mechanics knowledge are better, such that you can maybe like breeze right through it and get to, I don't want to say the good stuff, but the stuff you're actually, the new stuff you're looking to experience. But that's not a great experience to have to deal with every time you want to play a video game.
Yeah, and there's plenty of modern games that use that design philosophy of, oh, we want you to memorize this and get good at it. And so you try it over and over and over again. The problem is, most people aren't willing to do that for the entire game.
No.
People are willing to do that in chunks, but for the entire game, not really. And so this kind of leads into the other biggest problem with old games as far as like hardware/software. This is more in design of games, but it definitely has to do with the hardware itself. The lives and game over systems are usually pretty brutal. In old NES specifically is mostly what I'm thinking of when I think of this. Again, some Super Nintendo stuff, and by the time we got to N64, the brutalness of games had kind of faded.
Settled down some.
Yeah, because people could make games that were bigger. The reason why games used to be so enormously difficult was because the games themselves couldn't actually be that big.
Which was a massive, if we're talking about like hardware limitation, especially past like whatever processing or graphics or whatever the actual hardware was capable of, you know, back then storage was still massively at a premium. And so these guys were doing all that they could to pack as much game as they could onto these carts, onto these discs. But compared to even what was possible by like the invention of the CD, you know, for the PS1 or whatever, the CD was not invented for the PlayStation 1, but you know what I mean.
It was invented for the Sega CD, for the Sega Genesis, right?
But all of these games were brutally hard by design because they had to be, so you could get as much playtime out of them. Because actually, if the game was like easy, you would be able to blow through it in maybe like 25 minutes. And then, I spent $60 in the year of our Lord 1996 on this game. Come
Sometimes
on.
More.
Yeah, exactly. It would have been earlier before 1996, but
yeah, like Castlevania 1. That game is about 20 minutes if you don't mess up.
Yeah, just go through it. Yeah, exactly.
So, yeah, they wanted to make sure that people were getting their money's worth. And this was also kind of a holdover from like the arcade scene, where the design philosophy was to eat as many quarters as possible.
Yep. And so you have your quarter gets you X amount of lives, and then when those lives are gone, hey, you want to buy some more and keep going from right here? No? Okay.
Yeah. But a lot of those old NES games didn't have the option of picking back up.
Yeah, exactly.
Right,
you just lost.
Yeah. If you ran out of lives,
rather than continuing. Yeah.
If you ran out of lives, ran out of continues, then you just kicked back to the title screen unceremoniously, and you would have to try again, which kind of stunk.
And a lot of this like game over type of design philosophy was still carried over into some games with, saves and stuff where, especially if it's in a game, which very common design there for a while was like you can only save your game at basically almost only at like checkpoints where like you advance through the game far enough to reach the next point where the game will let you save the game. And if you died or got a game over or what have you, or messed up at some point along that stretch of the game, however long that stretch of the game may be, and you died, the option was usually not, oh, just respawn right where you are. It's, oh yeah, you're kicked back. You have to like reload your last saved game. This is especially prevalent in JRPGs. Even today, it's actually very prevalent in JRPGs.
Castlevania Symphony of the Night, if we're sticking with the Castlevania thing, did that. We were just kicking back to the main menu, you'd reload the save, reload wherever the last room was that you saved.
And even though like that's way different than losing all of your progress, you're maybe losing 5, 10, 15, 20 minutes of progress. That still could be like so discouraging that like when that has happened to me before in a game, there has been some times where I'm like, man, I don't actually want to replay through that 15 minutes of the game again, as dumb as that sounds. And I've just like put the game down and maybe never picked it back up.
Yeah, it's definitely not as frustrating, but can for sure be a barrier.
Yes, definitely.
Another barrier that a lot of old games had, this is specifically PS1, N64, Saturn era that I'm thinking of this. Bad frame rates.
Yep. They were not ready.
3D was kind of forced upon us before the technology was actually there because people just really wanted new stuff. And it's fine that this happened. I don't mind that this happened here and now, but developers did a poor job of prioritizing frame rates because most old sprite-based games would run at 60 frames per second to match the 60 hertz display rate of televisions. Whereas in the next generation, N64, PlayStation 1, they chopped it in half, maybe even more, to where everything started to run at 30 frames per second. And a lot of stuff struggled to meet that. Ocarina of Time runs at 20. 20 is its maximum. And it's that one at least is a usually solid 20.
Yeah.
But
when you're playing it, you can still feel that.
Yeah. So I guess those are two different things that people might have issues with. They're just low frame rates overall, just like consistently, or there's really bad dips where it dips from 30 down to like 15, which happens in like certain levels of GoldenEye, for example. So that can definitely cause some not fun gameplay experience. You're like, oh, this is not enjoyable to move around. This is not enjoyable to play. Why do people like this?
Mm-hmm. Yeah, it's especially when we're used to, at least decent frame rates in the modern world. Frame rates in general are kind of always maybe up and down a little bit, but there is a very specific time period of these older games filled with lauded classics, especially by people a little bit older than us, and in video game history in general, that the frame rate is just bad, and that's tough.
One thing I also wanted to mention is that even though the 5th generation kind of gets plopped with this, there's lots of games with bad frame rates. You know what generation also has really bad frame rates across the board?
7th.
Yeah. PS3, Xbox 360. They moved to high definition.
Yep.
Increased that pixel count and tried to do all these cool, neat post-processing effects, and those tanked frame rates. Like, they also were not really ready for the high definition era, but did it anyway and did their best with it.
I remember reading a lot of like interviewer, a lot of like game dev interviews around that time about their games that were coming out. I think it was like specifically an Assassin's Creed game or whatever. They were just like, someone like asked them, they're like, why do all of the Assassin's Creed games on the PS3 and Xbox 360, why all these games just run at 30 FPS? And they're like, oh, we're going for a cinematic feel.
But even so, even if they're not just running at 30 frames per second, like even the Assassin's Creed games, like I played Assassin's Creed 2. Yeah, you get frame drops, you get screen tearing, and it's just not a super pleasant experience. They're playable, but I totally get it if somebody looks at that and says, this is ruining the experience for me.
Yep. So in that exact vein, I think something that I bounce off of a lot of with some of these older games, for whatever reason, a lot of it does have to do with just like lower graphical fidelity. Like, even though a lot of these, I was raised on Gen 6, right?
Yep. GameCube, Xbox, PS2.
Yep. GameCube, Xbox, PS2. And, the graphics on those systems by today's standard are not great, but they did definitely benefit from having a console generation before them that figured out a lot of the stumbling blocks of 3D graphics and related. There was a lot of steps forward there. And whenever I try to go back before that era, there's a lot of times when my brain is just like, oh, this game is ugly. That's what's playing on a constant repeat whenever I try to play any N64 or PS1 game. I'm like, this game is ugly. This game looks bad. You do not enjoy playing this game. It's ugly. It looks bad. The frame rate's also sub 10 right now. What's happening? Yeah,
because the point of a video game is to like suck you into the world, and once you start hitting like all these speed bumps with you, they're like, oh, this game looks bad. Like, I can't tell what everything is supposed to be, and it just doesn't look pleasant. And yeah, if you combine that with any of these other previous issues that we've talked about, like, that can definitely ruin your enjoyment of a game.
Mm-hmm. Do the bad graphics in a game like ever really bother you, Murph? But bad maybe even meaning like old, because I don't know. Do you ever look at a PS2 game and you're like, this stinks, I'm out?
They got to be really bad, like to the point where it affects gameplay, like it has really bad draw distance, for example.
Okay. Yeah,
which is also something that you can run into with games from that era, where you're like, I just can't see where I'm going or what I'm doing, and so the game's not fun. So I would say that, but I'm much more likely to say, hey, this bad frame rate is ruining the game for me, than saying, hey, these graphics are ruining the game for me.
Okay. That's extremely fair. I think I'm more sensitive to that than you are.
Yeah. Which is fair. Well, that's why we're talking about all of these things, right? Because they are different for each individual person.
Yep, definitely. Well, here's something that I'm real sensitive to in some of these older games, Murph. A lot of these older games and a lot of these older consoles have some pretty big problems with their cameras and some pretty big problems with their control schemes, especially in early 3D games. The modern two-stick layout took a very long time to become the de facto standard for 3D games. Like, even so much so that, like, the GameCube controller kind of has a two-stick layout, in that the C stick is like a fake second stick. But even like the N64 shipped with one, the PS1 and Saturn shipped with none. These were consoles that were made for 3D gaming that did not come with a thumbstick on them. They didn't exactly know what we needed yet. And so when you sit down and you try to play an N64 game and operating in 3D space, well, you're moving your character with the one thumbstick you have, obviously. Well, what are we going to do with the camera? How are we going to control what we see? How are we going to, interact with the space around us if we can only move our character and can't move the camera? What's up with that?
Yeah, and the N64 is actually best case scenario from that console
generation. Yeah, because they still had a thumbstick.
Because that one at least had a thumbstick out of the gate. And Nintendo clearly thought about it, because the C buttons were for camera. Like, the C stood for camera. Yeah. So the C buttons on the N64 controller were supposed to be for the movable camera. And you can move that around like you saw in Mario 64. Plenty of platformers took advantage of that as well. But with things like Tomb Raider for the PS1 and Saturn, good luck. You're using tank controls, and how are you going to move the camera?
What do you mean by tank controls?
It's you press forward to move forward, and you have to stop and then move left, and then your character literally turns left. Because you know how in like Mario 64, the movement is a lot more like free flowing. Mm-hmm. Like when you press left, your character doesn't like stop and turn. He just kind of like moves
he
around.
kind of glides left. Yeah.
Yeah. So I think that is a way better and much more natural way of moving characters, which I think is one of the reasons why Mario 64 like stuck so hard with people, is because it figured that out pretty quickly compared to a lot of other 3D games. But it took a while for everybody to adopt that movement. And again, this is only for the movement of characters. The movement of the camera in a 3D space took even longer. Probably, I would say, all the way through that generation up to probably the beginning / middle of 6th generation to actually become...
That's a very, very Nintendo heavy podcast here, but that's a lot of that's one of the biggest complaints that a lot of people have about one of my favorite games that I try to recommend to a lot of people, Super Mario Sunshine. The camera in that game does kind of stink. It's at least controllable. It is controllable, but it's still rough. Controlling it is rough, and it likes to take automatic control from you a lot, and the automatic controller of the camera is not awesome.
Yeah, I guess that's another good point that we kind of don't really think about, is that the camera is not always just, hey, you put this on another stick or another few buttons, deal with it. The camera is like programmed in. Like if you think of like Sonic Adventure, for example, the camera is completely programmed. So once you get to a certain point, the camera will like zoom out, give you a nice cool view of the loop, and then zoom back into where it needs to be. That's a very extreme example of it, but the camera is programmed to like kind of point you where you need to go in these 3D games. And so the earlier that game is, the less likely they're going to have that programming. And if they do, the worse it's probably going to be. So there's just a lot of learning through the controller itself, through the software itself, for how to make a character move and how to make a camera work well with that character in 3D space. So that's definitely something that I totally understand people having issues with.
And that is, when I've talked about my history with the Legend of Zelda series on this podcast before. At least I imagine I have to have. And I actually played like Ocarina of Time and Majora's Mask relatively late in relation to a lot of the other games that I played. Like I had played and beaten Wind Waker, Twilight Princess, Skyward Sword, and also like both of the Oracle's games and, several other 2D Zelda games.
Playing the Oracle games before Ocarina of Time is madness.
Well, I didn't own an N64 and I had a Game Boy Advance. Come on.
That's true. True.
So that's what fueled that largely. And then I when I finally got the chance to play Ocarina of Time, having already played Skyward Sword, Twilight Princess, and Wind Waker especially, I said, oh, nothing about this game makes sense. I have to control the camera with the Z button.
And the Z button only, yeah.
And the Z button only, which was like a loop that I was kind of already used to from specifically Twilight Princess. And also like when you're playing Wind Waker and Skyward Sword, the game really gets you, and in Breath of the Wild, even now, the game does really get you into the habit of like centering the camera behind yourself with the targeting button, yada, yada, yada. It's a really easy way to quickly move the camera, but that's way different than having full control and having Z targeting as your only option. And that was Ocarina of Time is down farther on my personal Legend of Zelda rankings than it would be for a lot of people. And I do think a major part of that is because I was so immediately put off by how odd the camera was in comparison to like my modern standard for Legend of Zelda games. And that's just like one small example of like me being put off from, I think, just what is justifiably most of like video game thoughts, like most of video game thought collective being like one of, if not the best games of all time. I tried it and I was like, oh, the camera in this game stinks. I don't like it very much.
Yeah. And I think that's something that's a lot of people can run into, where you go back to an older game and you feel, hey, they've taken away something from me that I was used to. And so I have a harder time adjusting to this. And so this is something that we'll oftentimes talk about, like quality of life improvements.
QOL.
Yeah, QOL changes. And games are iterative. Like, as games in their series, or just gaming in general, continues to plod along, developers learn from previous games, and they keep trying to make improvements and tune games to be more friendly to new players, to be more enjoyable to play overall. So we throw this term QOL, or quality of life, around quite a bit. So what do we mean by, hey, newer games have more QOL stuff?
Yeah, so I think it's really hard to like objectively define quality of life, but I view it as basically just like the overall trend of video games being iterated on over and over and over again to like grind out the rough edges that were there for one reason or another and replace them with like a better version of the system that existed before, or or change the way the game plays entirely. That's not a quality of life. But I think a major quality of life change, for example, that we've seen over time is maybe, we already talked about save games. I think that the save systems have gone through two major quality of life overhauls over time. Like
that's a good way of looking at it. Yeah.
Maybe three even, like the invention of the save game. And then, the invention of the save game, then like, I don't know, rather than it being at the end of every level or what have you or whatever, giving you a bunch of different points at which you could save. And then now the like modern save anytime, most anytime, anywhere systems that we have now, where you can pretty much just like pick up and play any game. Or like, actually even now, like maybe we're in the final iteration of the save game, at least at this point, where save games actually matter a lot less than they used to, because you can just like stop and you can like suspend and resume a game pretty much anytime you want, as long as you don't want to swap games or swap apps or whatever. So that's like a continual iteration of like the similar system of, hey, what happens when you stop playing a game? Where do you go back? How do you mark your progress? That I think that's like one specific example in the overall scheme of video games. But I think a lot of where you see people specifically talking about like specific QOL features or whatever may be in the context of a series. For example, I think of Persona. I played Persona 5. Persona 5 Royal was my first ever Persona game. I now love the series a lot. I went back and I tried to play Persona 4, and I was like, oh, there is a lot of very obvious quality of life changes they made in this game. Like,
such as?
Well, I think a really big one to me is in Persona 5 Royal, the game will kind of go out of its way to make it very obvious to you when you have a lot of social links in the game. You have like relationships with people, and if certain things are fulfilled, you can like go and, advance your relationship with them and get the next part of their story and level up your like friendship level with them. And in Persona 4, it's very much just like, oh, I'm going to go around to all of my social links. I have to memorize where they hang out at different parts of the day, and I'm going to go and find them, and I'm going to talk to them, and then they're going to say something, and then the game will either be like, I think my relationship with X will advance, or I don't think my relationship with X will advance today. Should I spend time with them anyway? Where like you get to Persona 5 Royal, and it's like, hey, you're looking at the world map. Here's an exclamation point. That means Ryuji is in this area and he's ready to chat and you're going to level up, and that's like a massive, that makes the game much easier, much more streamlined to play. And
yeah.
And in the same series too, like Persona 5 to Persona 5 Royal, your characters can have guns. In Persona 5, when you enter the dungeon, each of your characters get like one clip of ammo, and that's all they get. And then in Persona 5 Royal, they were like, wait, that stinks. It makes guns basically useless. Your guns reload at the beginning of every battle. And that's just like another small tweak. Anyways, so Murph, what do you think about quality of life? How do you define quality of life?
Yeah, I think that's an interesting point. Of that, it's just very difficult to define. One thing that I think a lot of people equate to quality of life is they'll say, "Hey, it makes the game easier," and they'll equate those two things. But I don't think those two are necessarily. They're correlated, but they're not exactly the same thing, I feel. To me, quality of life is not just making a game easier, it is wasting your time less. Mm-hmm. So little things like, one thing I liked about the Ocarina of Time 3DS remake, we keep coming back to stupid Ocarina of Time on this podcast.
Well, when we're talking about like classic games that a lot of people like to recommend that may appear less shiny now than they used to, I think Ocarina of Time is a great example to use over and over again.
Yeah. And again, like we did the topic of like we re-ranked these games, and I still think Ocarina of Time has held up incredibly well. But one thing that I like that the 3DS remake does is it adds things like gyro aiming that just makes aiming more fun. It has the ability to put the iron boots on the touchscreen, so it's a one-touch thing. So whenever you're in the water temple, you can just press a button
and instantly put on your boots.
And so you're doing exactly the same thing. You are equipping the boots in the game's terms. You are just skipping, going through multiple menus in order to do that every single time. And so that's just getting rid of time wasting. Thus, I would say that is a good quality of life change.
Yeah, I think that definitely makes a lot of sense. Or like, yeah, hey, we put fast travel in this open world game. I don't know if open world games really existed without fast travel, but hey, we did it. Yoo-hoo! It's a quality of life change.
Yeah, and that's not to say that the quality of life changes can't make a game easier. Sometimes they do.
Yes.
Like in the water temple in 3DS, they add like these lines on the wall to show you where everything is going and where you need to go to like raise and lower the water, and that does make it easier. Mm-hmm. But I think it makes the game better. That's a little bit more subjective.
Yeah,
but
the water temple being so obtusely confusing is like, I think, a objective, mark
against
the game. Yes, exactly. And so like, by going back and fixing, that error, I'm sure that, they found a way to keep the temple challenging, but sanding out some of the rough edges that made it like not frustrating because it was tough, frustrating because it was really fiddly annoying and also just like objectively confusing.
Yeah.
That seems like a great change to make.
Yeah, and this brings us to, so we want to talk about, like, there's all these problems that people run into, right? How do you get around these problems? Like, what can we do as gamers to try to fix them? Because these are inherent problems. So are they mindset issues? Are they just, like, the game has problems in and of itself? It could be a mix of all of these. So one thing that you can do is you can try to emulate a game or do a port of a game. It can be an official emulator or otherwise, but this can help add things like save states. So if you're frustrated with the design of an old game that doesn't have saves, then you can just play it on an emulator, hit a save state, and then keep trying and retrying the part that you suck at, or the part that's giving you a lot of issues. Or you can just do something where you're like, oh, well, I'm gonna save state every level. So put a save state at the beginning of the level, you get a game over, all right, reload the save states. And then when you get to the next level, you can make a new save state. And then just when you get a game over, you just reload that save state. And so that can kind of bring like the old design of games a lot more in line with newer design philosophies, which can help out a lot with enjoyment.
Save states do also just do a great job of replicating a lot of like the modern, put a game down, be able to pick it up right where you were. So, you want to, oh, I have to go do this now because I'm an adult. Well, I'll just save state it, and then the next time I'm ready to play it, I'll be right back to where I was. Cool.
Yeah. And one other part about like emulators and ports that can be super helpful is that it can fix bad frame rates and perhaps even make the graphics better. Like you can upscale it so everything's at a higher resolution. that doesn't necessarily fix like the inherent, like you think, oh, the models look bad because they're just like designed poorly, or they don't have that many polygons, whatever. That's a different problem. Only that can be fixed with like a full-on ground-up remake, which, again, that also could be a very good way to enjoy some of these games. Like, you like Crash Bandicoot, the Insane Trilogy is very good. We did do a whole episode about remakes and remasters, so we're not going to go into that too much, but just know that that is a very good option to look into if you are having some issues with just the oldness of these games.
Yep. Fixing the controls is the thing that, like, if you want controls fixed, you'll probably have to look to a remake, a remaster, playing the game on a modern console, because you know what? They're not. It's hard to fix some of these problems. They may not even be fixable at all in the first place. And some of these, you know, some games, even if you try to play it on a modern console, it could even cause a worse experience. Like the N64. The N64 games, a lot of them do actually rely upon, you know, the four C buttons existing. Yeah, the four C buttons existing. And like, unless you're maybe really competent at playing a game on a keyboard, replicating a controller, you're going to have some trouble with, you know, emulating an N64 game on a modern controller.
Yeah, like there's not a super great way for even like a Nintendo Switch controller to match the way that the buttons are configured on a Nintendo 64. Like, there just isn't really a good way to do that, which is why I'm very glad that Nintendo has like the Nintendo 64 Switch controller for all those like Nintendo 64 online games, so that you can get around that problem. So, kind of tricky.
So, well, what about, you know, you don't want an emulator, you don't want to play a port, you don't want to play a remake, and yet you still find yourself bouncing off a lot of these earlier games, especially if a lot of your problems come from something which we didn't really discuss all that much, but it's in the QOL circle. You know, you find yourself jumping into a game, maybe even, you know, you've played a later game in a series, and then you try to jump back earlier, and you're like, wow, this is just a worse version of the game I've already played. Mm-hmm. You know, I do think what really helps me is like starting at absolute ground zero. I'm going to start, especially in the context of a series, just go all the way back to the beginning. It can help you get a better appreciation and understanding of how far all the other games have come over time. If you can like overcome the most annoying or quote unquote bad, you know, if we want to talk about it more easily, parts of that early game, and you can like find the nugget that's there and enjoy yourself, you hop to the second game in the series, or, you know, something, you know, similar to that, and they'll just be like, oh, this rocks.
Yeah, I think context is very important whenever you play classic video games. Is that, take something like Metal Gear Solid. So a few years ago, I started playing the Metal Gear franchise all the way through, and I wanted to start at the very beginning. And people kept saying like, "Oh, you want to play Twin Snakes instead of the original one?" I'm like, no, I'm going to play the original, because I think it'll give me better context for the series overall. Mm-hmm. And I did struggle with that game a little bit. It took me a while to get into. There was a lot of like design aspects of it that I didn't really like. A few things that were just kind of obtuse. But at the end of the day, I am glad that I played that version. And I think it gave me better appreciation for things that ended up coming later. And now I would say that I do enjoy the game. But I did have to go in with that headspace of, hey, this is a game from 1998. This was like one of the first games that had like a real story, and it has action style cutscenes and everything. Like, this was new territory for a lot of gamers. And so just being able to keep that specialness in mind, I think helps out quite a bit and can help get you past a lot of those rough edges. And yeah, then when you end up getting to like Metal Gear Solid 4, you can step back and be like, yeah, this series has come a long way. Like, look at all this cool stuff. Or Metal Gear Solid 5, like, I can pick dudes up and move them all over the place. I can drop a rock on these people. Like, I can do anything. And I think that's coolness factor gets enhanced by seeing where the series started from. So that is how I would recommend enjoying series, but to each their own. I would at least say give it a try.
Yep, definitely. Well, Murph.
Yeah.
What if we give it the old college try? What if we have emulated it or tried to play a remaster or gone all the way back to ground zero, holding the context in our mind, and we still just are put off by one gameplay feature? The core design doesn't appeal to us. I'm an adult who lives a life, and I just keep struggling over and over again with this save system, and then what?
Then that's okay.
Dang it!
That's fine.
No!
It is okay to not like a game, even if other people do like it. Like, if you're saying, hey, this game doesn't click with me, it's cool. Don't worry about it. You do not have to like a game just because other people like it. So I think that's one thing you can do when you're looking at some old games, is like kind of take a step back and take stock of what type of games that you do like. So, like, do you like story-heavy single-player experiences? Well, you might like Final Fantasy VII, but I don't think you'll like Daytona USA that much.
Mm-hmm. Yeah, right? I think that's like one of the things that does make a lot of these conversations around like the old classic games, TM, kind of tough. It can be really, it can feel really oddly strange to go back and try one of these games that, through the great consensus of all gamers everywhere, has been labeled as one of the best games of all time, or one of the best games on the platform, or one of the best games of this genre, or really foundational. But it still can just be not for you. And that's okay. You're not a consensus gamer. You're you.
Yeah, we ran into this issue when we were going through and re-rating all of the top 10 games on Metacritic, and Soul Calibur was up there, and we're like, we just don't get it. What is this doing here?
It's a pretty great 2D fighter, 3D fighter.
But neither of us are particularly like fighting game fans.
Yep, they're fine. They're fun to mess around with.
Exactly. And that's about as far as I think either of us will take fighting games.
Yep.
So if you don't like fighting games, don't go trying like all of these excellent fighting game experiences and expecting your mind to be blown. Now, I'm not saying don't go into them at all, because you might find something that you do enjoy. You might find a new genre or a new game that you might like. So still go in with an open mind, but also be okay with saying, hey, I don't really like fighters, and Street Fighter 2 is just one of the earliest fighters, so I don't really like it that much. That's fine.
And I have, again, already talked about this on the podcast, but through much crying and gnashing of teeth and trying over and over and over again, I have like finally come to the conclusion that, for whatever reason, even though it is like one of historically the most popular, historically one of the most important genres of video games out there, 2D platformers will just almost certainly never ever click for me. Even, I was playing Celeste for some gameplay footage after I had complained about it for a whole 15 minutes on one of our first episodes, and even when I was playing it again, I was like, okay, this is like, I'm having some fun. This is better than I remember. And then I got it about 20 minutes into playing it, and I was like, well, and I was having some good fun, but I could be playing any other video game and having a better time than I'm having now. And that's, that's okay. And that's the frustrating thing about it to me too. Is like 3D platformers are one of my favorite genres of games. Many 3D platforming games are some of my favorite games of all time. For whatever reason, the 2D platformers, big snooze.
Yeah. What type of games are you drawn to then? Because that's another good thing that I think you can step back and say, hey, what kind of games do I like? And try to match that with some of the older stuff.
Yeah, like I know I love 3D platformers. I love a great many JRPGs. Like I can just go back and probably play an early Final Fantasy game, and even though there's like less quality of life changes, way earlier version of the games I love now, I still have a blast. I've in fact done that in the not so distant past, all that kind of stuff. Yeah, look at the genres of games that you love and match it to a past game to the best of your ability.
Yeah, like for me, I don't love shoot 'em ups. much, and I don't love fighting games. Both of them are okay in moderation, but there's just not enough depth there to like keep me that interested.
Yep.
And so I usually kind of like don't gravitate towards those. Not saying that there isn't depth in fighting games, but just not depth that I'm willing to commit to.
Yeah, definitely.
So yeah, I love like arcade racers, platformers, RPG type adventure games. Like those are the types of games for me. And so those are the types of games that if you're trying to go back and start doing some video game collecting, I think try to gravitate towards those.
Yeah.
By that I mean your interests, not specifically
Yes.
my interests.
Yes, definitely. So like those are the things, like we have identified the things that we really, really like, and that has helped us go back and play some older games. But is there any specific reasons that like we can't enjoy older games? Like it's personal for everyone. Like we were saying, like what you like is very personal for you, and if you help figure that out, that'll help you find games. But like, what about, dislikes are also personal. I said I don't like, you said you don't really love fighters. I don't really love 2D platformers. But what about like, is there anything in particular when it comes to like the design of games, all that kind of stuff for us personally, like that makes us bounce right off of them?
Yeah, I think I mentioned it, but depth or lack thereof kind of is my issue with games. And so NES era is kind of like teeters for me, because I feel like a lot of those games just don't have the depth that I'm looking for in a video game. And they're difficult enough that, I mean, I put them on for like 10, 15 minutes, and then I hit that wall where I'm like, okay, I either spend time and commit time to playing this and beating it, or just give up. And usually I'm on the give up side of things. And so that's not to say that's the case with every NES game. Like there's plenty that I love, like Kirby's Adventure. You can save. It's pretty easy. It's actually a really surprisingly solid game. But part of that is that it came out really late in the NES's lifespan. So it did help that it benefited from like more modern game design, even though it was on an older console. So yeah, I think depth is the big one for me, which is why I tend to gravitate towards stuff in the 5th and 6th generation of consoles.
Yeah.
And 7th generation, I suppose.
Yeah,
because
like
those
deeper,
to me feel like
deeper gameplay systems, more fleshed out stories, probably some stuff to do on the side outside of the core gameplay loop.
Yeah, those to me
There's a
feel
lot there
like
to chew on.
there are like some good arcadey experiences, but there's also like some good games that you can sink your teeth into and get your money's worth. Because like if I got $30 to spend and I could spend it on a game that'll keep me occupied for 10 minutes, or I can spend it on something that could keep me occupied for 10, 20 hours, I'll pick the longer one. Now, there are diminishing returns. I'd rather play a 10-hour game that I can replay than like a 100-hour game, which is why RPGs, I do tend to bounce off a lot. I like RPGs. It's just the time commitment.
So some of them are just so long.
Yeah, but they end up having like kind of the same reasoning for me as like these older games, because I'm like, hey, I have put this much time into it. If I want to go all the way, I'm gonna have to go all the way. Do I want to do that, or do I just want to give up now?
Yep.
And sometimes give up now is what ends up happening.
Yep. For me, it's really a weird scenario. Like the big hangups that I have is kind of just like I wasn't there. I had a relatively late start in gaming in general. Like I've said before that the GameCube was my first system, which was like by the time I got it too. Like by the time I got it, I mean, I guess we got it around the same time, given that we both kind of got the same combo pack, second release of the GameCube.
You got the combo pack. I got a single GameCube by itself, 4 controllers,
my bad.
Super Smash Bros. Melee, and Cars the video game.
But the GameCube was my first system. I got it relatively late in its lifespan. And then like I also quickly latched onto the PS2 and to some extent the Xbox as well. And then the Wii, and then the PS4, and then the Switch. But it wasn't like the only game series that I like went out of my way to go back and explore during that time was The Legend of Zelda, because I enjoyed the Legend of Zelda games that I got to play so much. I said, oh, cool, I'm going to go play the rest of the games in these series. But it wasn't around the time that I was like basically a daily PS4 gamer that I decided to like actually start purposefully looking back at the history of games and trying to play a wider range of impactful, whatever you want to call it, games. And it was a tough nut for me to crack. Like, the lack of quality of life, defining quality of life, I think closely to how you did. Like, oh, this is just makes a game less annoying to play. Not even easier, but less annoying to play. In genres, designs, even like genres that I loved, made it so much harder for me to go back to these games and like actually lock onto them and keep in that like gaming flow state or whatever you want to have. There's just like such a high percentage in a lot of these older games I'm trying to play, and unless I'm really dedicated to it, I'll just like hit enough of a string of annoyances within a span of time that I'm just like, you know what, I'm off it. That's my biggest hang up.
So like GameCube, PS2, Xbox is like kind of your cutoff points. Like stuff before that, you're not a huge fan of.
It's
just
stuff
as a general
before
rule.
That. As
not
a
with
general
everything,
rule,
but
it's that's kind of the inflection point where I think the biggest part of it is just like, that's like where my basal, I don't want to say like quality standard, but like QOL standard across the industry, I guess, was kind of set.
What you started with. That's what you got used to.
Where like if I had started with the N64, then I'm sure that whatever quips and quibbles, come part and parcel with that generation of gaming, the PS1, the N64, the Saturn, I'm sure that whatever downfalls those games had as a standard comparison to what we have now, I would have been like, oh, well, yeah, I grew up with that and I can deal with it now, but not me.
I find that interesting between the two of us, because for me, I very quickly started going into, so I started playing video games. What is there that came before this? And I do credit the Super Smash Brothers series for like kind of getting me interested in that very, very quickly, because the first question after you play Melee or Brawl or whatever it is like, where did these characters come from? Who are these people? And so it was at a point where the internet was like very accessible and I could look these things up and figure out where they came from. Oh, Star Fox, Fox McCloud. He's from his last game was Star Fox 64 is what his model's based off of. But he also has this game called Star Fox Adventures and Star Fox Assaults that you can play on the system that you just bought. I'm like, sick. So I'm going to try some of that stuff out. And then like with Brawl, the Masterpiece collection in Brawl, where you could play like demos of games. That's what got me interested in Ocarina of Time, because I was able to play it. And I was like, oh, this seems sick. I want to play the whole thing. And so I did. And it was sick. And I love the whole game. But that was definitely earlier on for me than it sounds like it was for you.
Mm-hmm. Yeah, no, it definitely was. And so, like, maybe if I had started delving back earlier, then I may have had some of these things removed from me. But,
yeah,
I don't know.
So, yeah, overall, this is kind of a tricky subject because everybody has their own individual experiences that impact how you view games and gaming. So I think just the best advice we can give is try to keep an open mind with whatever you do, whatever you try to play. Just play what looks interesting, but if you are not getting into it, that's okay. Try something else. There's so much stuff in this world for you to enjoy that you do not need to be stuck on whether you do or do not like Super Mario Sunshine. You just don't.
Well, Murph,
yeah,
I think we've talked this topic all the way up and down. So I guess it's time to move on to the recurring segment of the show, our one and only, our recent pickups.
Dun, dun, dun. All right, so my recent pickup actually surprisingly has somewhat to do with this topic, which I didn't actually realize until like just now.
Yeah, just right now, yeah.
I don't really like survival horror games.
Mm-hmm.
Like that's just not really a genre that I've really ever enjoyed. Like the Resident Evils that I like are like 4 and 5. And those are the least survival horror out of all of those. Those are a lot more like action focused. So yeah, survival horror, just not my thing. So I was trying to like build up my Wii U collection, and I was like, what are the big ones that people liked from the Wii U back in the day? And so one that I picked up because it was dirt cheap, I bought a brand new copy of Zombie U for $8 because why not? Totally can do that. I wasn't expecting
free.
Yeah, I wasn't expecting much from this game, but I actually really like it.
Yeah?
Yeah, we were talking about it a little bit beforehand, and you said that you didn't like this game. You thought it was kind of crappy. Why do you not like it?
I need to go back and visit it again. I haven't really given it like the good college try that I believe it deserves. My experience with it was like around that. So I didn't have a Wii U until I was, I don't know, 25.
That's fair. The Wii U has a lot of issues.
Yes,
and most of the
exactly.
good games are ported to the Switch.
But when the Wii U was coming out and current and all of that kind of stuff, it was like my dream to own a Wii U.
Oh,
I was a 15-year-old Nintendo kid, right? I was like, man, I want the Wii U, and one of the
at launch, baby.
Exactly. And at launch, Zombie U was like one of the games I had a Nintendo Power subscription, and there was just like some coverage of Zombie U in Nintendo Power, and I was just like, yeah, this game looks really sick. It looks to be an interesting, fun game that we wouldn't really get on Nintendo consoles usually, and it seems to be using the gamepad really well, which is like something that always appeals to me because that's the killer app of the Wii U. Is
that's the
having
point of the Wii
whole
U.
second screen. Yeah. So I had like really hyped it up in my mind, and then I went to play it as a 25-year-old adult, like a decade after the game first came out, and I was like, yeah, that's a survival horror game. Cool.
So I very much had a similar kind of impression to you, where I saw the game and was like, oh, that seems sick. But I didn't end up picking it up at launch because I bought the whole system and I only bought a couple games for it. I didn't even buy Nintendo Land. I didn't buy New Super Mario Brothers U. I bought like
Nintendo Land is awesome.
I bought like Sonic and All Stars Racing Transformed as my holdover for Mario Kart 8 and Call of Duty Black Ops 2. It was a weird batch of games that I picked up. Don't regret it. Both those games actually ridiculously awesome. So I'm glad that I was able to play those on the Wii U. But Zombie U was always one that I kind of had in the back of my mind where I'm like, oh, this seemed cool. And so that's kind of what I was thinking of when I picked it up now, not expecting much of it. But I actually really like kind of everything that this game does from a design perspective. The two interesting things that I find is that it is able to have a narrative that continues to move forward, even though your character dies. Your characters perma-die. So once you die in the game, you start as a new character. And you have to
go and get your stuff, right?
Yeah, you can go get your stuff. You have to go find your old character.
Yeah.
And just...
Oh, kill them.
Kill them.
Yeah.
Beat them mercilessly with a cricket bat, and then get your stuff back.
Yep.
And the game just continues.
Pretty cool, like, death idea loop.
Yeah, and so it makes you really, like, not want to die, because you're like, crap, if I die, my character is gone. My character is now a zombie. It's
like a cool way of doing permadeath that you can then, like, recover from.
Yeah, so I really liked that perspective. There's also a mode where you just perma-die and have to start the game from the beginning.
I didn't do that. Over. Yeah.
It sucks. I don't want to do that.
Yeah, no, that's a little much.
But I think one thing that I was really surprised about was how much it nailed the Wii U gamepad. Mm-hmm. Because I think the Wii U gamepad has always kind of like had this tension between you're looking at the TV or you're looking at the gamepad. And there's games like Star Fox Zero, where you're just like bouncing your head back and forth in between them. And it's not amazing. It's not great. Like there's clearly this tension of like, well, what are you supposed to be looking at?
Yep.
And just right off the bat, Zombie U makes it so that that tension is baked into the gameplay. Because when you're looking at the gamepad, the game is still running on the TV. And so you have to keep like looking up like, am I doing okay? Or whatever you're doing on the gamepad. Like you got to do it fast because you don't know what else is out there. So everything is like kind of in real time. And I really appreciate that tension.
Yeah, sounds pretty sick to me.
Yeah.
Maybe I'll have to give the venerable Zombie U another try.
Either way, $8 well spent. I have had a great like 3 hours with the game so far. So even if I never go any further, I would say I got my money's worth.
Excellent. Yeah, I think I also got mine for like under $10 on eBay or whatever. I had like acquired a Wii U and I was like, all right, time to live the dream.
Yep. Yeah, clearly it didn't sell well because if you're able to sell like brand new copies for under $10, like, ooh, that means you got a lot of stock.
Yep, exactly. exactly.
How about you, Cal?
Well, I also picked up a game that did not sell very well. It's just like, I'm not spending that much money right now, but
is it a GameCube game?
It is a GameCube game. I went down I was in the area for other errands I was running and swung through the local game store, and I said, hey, I would pay that very low amount of money to own X-Men 2 Wolverine's Revenge.
Sure.
Yeah. The back looks bad.
Have you played it at all?
I have not. I have not yet played it. But I am planning on playing it. I don't have high hopes because it's a licensed, movie tie-in game from the era of peak those being not good.
So it's not like the X-Men Legends games. It's like based off of like X2.
Yeah, it's based. It is based off of X2. Yeah.
Okay.
It is X2. It is an X2 movie.
I see.
Yeah. Unsheath your razor-sharp claws, unleash lethal combo attacks, and use accelerated healing powers as you tear into intense action in stealth scenarios.
Yeah, that sounds like a licensed video game tagline for sure.
Yeah, exactly. So, but this is GameCube game number 97.
Oh, he's coming up on 100.
Yep, coming up on 100. So
real close.
And I had like some aspirations about 100 being like a really cool game, but unless my finances change relatively soon, I do not think that will be the case.
Yeah,
but we'll see.
That's fine.
We'll see.
Or you could just stop buying GameCube games entirely. Who's with me?
Yeah, I know. Who needs a GameCube game? Not me.
Yeah, you do.
Well, I don't know. I could make game 100 like Mario Party 5 or something. I don't own all the Mario Party games, and I like them all. So
are you missing 5? Which ones do you have?
I have 4 and 7. I'm missing 5 and 6. Yeah.
Yeah. I had 4 first, and then people were like, you got to play 6. I'm like, sure, I'll play 6. So I picked that one up, and I also very much like that.
7 is my favorite from the Mario Party gameplay perspective wise. At least from the game, like just for like the boards and the mini games and stuff.
Oh wow. Both. Dang.
Yeah, both. And but 5 has my favorite mini game. It has like a very silly, very dumb, like car building and fighting mini game, like not mini game, but like separate game mode for some reason. And I had a blast with that as a kid. So
my favorite mini game was I think Book Squirm from Mario Party 4.
Mario Party 4. Yeah,
that's my favorite Mario Party mini game of all time.
One of my favorites as well.
Because I loved pushing my siblings underneath the pages of the falling books.
Yep. Well, good times. I've really enjoyed, not to completely derail the conversation into the Mario Party episode, which we've had on the episode thoughts doc list for a while now. But I have really enjoyed the Super Mario Party Superstars on the Nintendo Switch, because it's pretty much just like a gigantic mashup of Mario Party, technically 1 through 7, but it is very 4 and 7 heavy.
Yeah, I do want to play Jamboree. I think the new one is.
I've seen a lot of really good reviews for it. A lot of people are like, yep, we're back to form, baby. This feels like a good evolution of the format.
It took ND Cube forever to figure it out.
Correct.
Because they started in 9, because Hudson kind of dissolved, and so they had an internal team take over, and they just like had it so rough ever since 9. But yeah, I think Super Mario Party was like a good glimmer. Mario Party Superstars was like, okay, I think we got this. And now that Mario Party Jamboree is good, everyone's like, all right, here we go. We got this.
Mario Party is back.
It's back, baby.
Yep. All right. Well, I guess now that we've talked about Mario Party, that means that we are happy gamers.
Yep. Happy gaming.
Who are happy gaming.